In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, where the cold gnawed at the bones and winter could last for months, one man's obsession with survival led him to an ingenious discovery. His cabin, a spiral fortress against the frost, became the beacon of innovation, a design that would forever change how settlers withstood the relentless mountain chill. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from, and if survival stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even bolder frontier tale you won't want to miss. The mountains seemed endless, an expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. Snow had fallen early that year, burying the land under a thick blanket that refused to retreat. For David Tanner, this was not his first winter in the Rockies, but this year felt different. He had chosen the site for his cabin carefully, a spot nestled between two towering ridges, offering both isolation and protection from the worst winds. But as the temperature plunged, he began to realize that his new home, like every other he'd built in the past, was woefully inadequate against the elements. The design of his cabin was simple, a classic log structure with thick beams notched at the corners and chinked with clay and moss. It had served other men well, but David's thoughts were always on the next challenge, the next survival problem to solve. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and despite the fire crackling in the hearth, the cold crept in through every crevice. His thick fur coat did little to stop the chill as he sat by the fire, staring at the shadows flickering on the walls. The familiar sight of his breath clouding in the air was a constant reminder that something needed to change. David had learned a hard lesson early in his trapping days. Surviving the mountains was not just about strength or skill with a rifle. It was about making your shelter a sanctuary, an impenetrable fortress that could weather any storm. His thoughts turned to the harsh winters he had endured, the nights spent in poorly constructed cabins where the cold seeped in and ate at his bones, robbing him of the rest he needed to face another day of hunting and trapping. The cabins he'd seen, the ones that had lasted for generations, still fell short in the face of the mountain's fierce cold. Something was missing, something crucial. That night, as the storm raged outside, David lay awake, his mind spinning with ideas. He thought of the spiral shape he'd seen in nature, how the winds around a mountain would swirl in tight spirals, always finding their way through the weakest points. What if a cabin could do the opposite? What if a home could trap heat, as the spiral of the land trapped the storm? The idea formed quickly, fueled by the isolation and the need for survival. David spent the next few weeks measuring and planning, gathering the materials for his new design. He wasn't just building a cabin. He was constructing a sanctuary, a structure that could fight against the harsh mountain winters, keeping warmth in and the freezing cold out. His design was unconventional, with walls that curled in a spiral, following the natural flow of the land, creating a structure that would not just house him, but protect him. David's plan was as simple as it was radical, a spiral-shaped cabin that would wind upward from a central core, its walls forming a protective barrier against the winter winds. He had no formal training in architecture, but his years of living in the mountains had taught him the importance of adaptability. The traditional rectangular cabins he had built in the past were strong, but they didn't account for the way the wind worked in the mountains. They were rigid, and rigidity was a weakness when it came to the elements. With this in mind, David set to work. The first step was to clear a space in the snow, marking the center where the fire would burn and where he would spend most of his time. From this central point, the cabin would spiral outward, a design that would allow the walls to curve in such a way that they would deflect the wind, rather than allowing it to tear at the structure. Each log was carefully chosen for its strength and straightness, and the process of fitting them together began with the outermost layer. The logs were stacked in a tight spiral, each layer carefully notched and locked into place. This wasn't like the standard log cabins where walls were built up vertically. Here, the logs were interwoven, winding around the central core, making the cabin stronger, more secure. The real test came when he had completed the walls. David stepped back to look at his work, the spirals of wood forming a strange and beautiful shape against the snow. It didn't look like any cabin he had ever seen, but it felt right. The roof was next, a dome that would curve over the walls and protect the structure from the weight of the snow. The design was as much about practicality as it was about beauty. The curves would trap heat, funneling it down to the center, where the fire would burn and keep the inside warm. As he worked, the mountain seemed to watch him, a silent observer to his toil. David was used to the quiet of the wilderness, but this felt different. The storm outside raged on, a reminder of the world he was up against. Each log that he placed, each turn of the spiral, was a small victory against the cold, a promise that his new home would survive where others had failed. By the end of the second week, the cabin had taken shape, its spiral walls standing tall against the mountain winds. Inside, it was surprisingly warm. The fire crackled in the center, sending heat up to the highest point of the dome before it was funneled back down. David stood inside his creation, feeling a sense of pride and relief wash over him. This was no ordinary cabin. It was a fortress, a sanctuary built for survival in the harshest conditions. And for the first time in weeks, he felt as though the mountain had been tamed, at least in this one small corner of the wilderness. The true test of David's spiral cabin came in the early days of December. The mountains had already begun to show their harshness, and the air was thick with snow. From the moment he stepped outside to tend to his traps, he could feel the temperature dropping, creeping into the marrow of his bones. The wind cut through the mountains like a predator on the hunt, its icy fingers finding every crack and crevice in the land. David knew that in the past, such a storm would have driven him into the safety of his cabin, huddling near the fire and praying the warmth would hold. But this year was different. He was no longer merely surviving. He was testing the limits of his design, putting his hard work through the harshest trial the mountains could offer. He returned to the cabin after several hours of setting his traps, the wind howling in his ears as he made his way up the slope toward the structure. From a distance, it looked even more imposing, the spiraling walls of logs deflecting the wind like the edge of a mighty shield. As he drew closer, his breath visible in the air, he marveled at how the design seemed to work in perfect harmony with the environment. Inside, the fire still burned, its warmth spilling into the space with a comforting glow. The cold that had gripped him outside seemed miles away now. He smiled to himself, knowing that while other men were scrambling to add fuel to their fires or shiver through long, bitter nights, he would be warm. The cabin held heat, and it held it well. The spiral walls acted like a thermal trap, capturing the rising heat and forcing it to circulate back down, making every corner of the cabin comfortable. That night, the storm howled with a fury David had never witnessed. Snow piled up around the cabin's base, swirling in blinding white gusts. Outside, the world had vanished behind a wall of ice and wind. But inside, the temperature remained steady, and the fire burned strong. The cabin, for all its unconventional design, had proven itself to be more than just a shelter. It had become a sanctuary against the most unforgiving of elements. David stayed up late, his thoughts turning to his next task, improving the cabin even further. He could hear the wind battering the walls, the soft creaks of the logs as they shifted slightly with the pressure of the storm. But despite the intensity of the storm outside, there was no fear in David's heart. His creation was solid, built to endure. The spiral cabin had passed its first test, and David had proven that innovation could triumph over nature's most brutal challenges. As the winter deepened, word of David's spiral cabin began to spread throughout the nearby settlements and among the trapping community. At first, it was just a passing curiosity. A strange design, a cabin unlike any other in the mountains. But as the storm season raged on, more and more men began to take notice. They spoke of the cabin in hushed tones, marveling at its ability to withstand the worst of the winter's fury. One afternoon, as David returned from checking his traps, he was greeted by a group of men standing outside his cabin. They were a rough-looking group dressed in thick furs and heavy coats, their faces weathered from years of surviving the elements. David recognized them immediately as fellow trappers, men who had long earned their living by venturing into the mountains and braving the dangers of the wilderness. "Well, if it ain't Tanner's spiral," one of the men called out, a rough laugh in his voice. "We heard tell you were building yourself a fortress." David smiled and nodded, stepping up to the group. "Fortress is a good word for it," he said. "I've spent the better part of this season testing it, and I've been lucky enough to find it's more than just a shelter. It's a sanctuary, really." The men looked at each other, skepticism still on their faces. One of them, an older trapper with a graying beard, stepped forward. "So you reckon it'll keep the cold out, eh? Or is it just another fancy idea that'll collapse when the real storms hit?" David motioned for the men to follow him inside, opening the door and gesturing for them to step into the warmth of the cabin. The fire crackled in the center, its light spilling onto the spiral walls. The air inside was warm, the temperature a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. "Feel for yourselves," David said with a nod. "I've built this cabin to be strong enough to withstand not only the weather, but also the predators that roam these mountains. The spiral design traps heat like a furnace and keeps the cold outside. The wind doesn't stand a chance." The men stepped inside, some hesitant at first, others eager to see if the stories had been true. As they settled into the warmth, their faces softened. The heat, the comfort, the solid structure, it all spoke for itself. They could feel the difference. "It's no ordinary cabin," one of the younger trappers said, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." David shrugged modestly. "I just wanted something that worked better than what we've been building. It's not perfect, but it's a start." The men stayed for a while, warming themselves by the fire, listening to David's plans for further improvements. They asked questions, offered advice, and some even laughed at the absurdity of the design. But deep down, they all knew one thing. David had created something special, something that could change the way mountain men built their homes forever. Before they left, they promised to spread the word, to tell their friends about the cabin that trapped heat better than any structure they had ever seen. David stood at the door and watched as they disappeared into the snow, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had built more than just a shelter. He had built something that would last, something that could change the lives of those who had to endure the wilderness in the harshest of seasons. The reputation of the spiral cabin was growing, and with it, the understanding that survival in the mountains was not just about strength and skill, but also about innovation and the will to adapt. By the middle of winter, the mountains were entrenched in their icy grasp. Snow fell relentlessly, and the winds grew stronger with each passing day. David had grown accustomed to the cold, but this season was different. He had come to depend on the warmth his spiral cabin provided. Each morning, when he stepped into the cabin after braving the freezing air outside, he was reminded that his work was paying off. The interior of the cabin was always warm, the fire never failing to keep the chill at bay. But it was on one particularly harsh evening that David's cabin was truly put to the test. As the sun dipped below the ridgeline and the sky turned dark, a massive storm rolled in, fiercer than any David had witnessed in his years on the frontier. The winds howled like wild beasts, whipping the snow into blinding flurries, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling low. A storm like this could break a man, leaving him exposed to nature's wrath. David had ventured out earlier in the day to check his traps, but the weather had worsened so suddenly that he had to seek shelter. His hands and face were frozen, his breath visible in the air as he staggered back toward the cabin, the wind biting through his layers. He was exhausted, but the sight of his cabin, solid, winding, and full of promise, was a relief. There was a promise of warmth inside, a sanctuary he could always return to. The storm grew more violent, its fury shaking the walls of the cabin as if the mountain itself was trying to tear him apart. Inside, the fire was roaring, its heat radiating through the spiral walls and enveloping David in comfort. The storm battered the cabin for hours, but David noticed that the design of his home held strong. The spiral walls, which were so unorthodox in construction, did more than just trap heat. They deflected the wind with their curve, the logs acting like shields against the onslaught. The roof, domed and sloped, allowed the snow to slide off, never accumulating to a dangerous depth. He sat by the fire, the storm raging outside, but the warmth within made him feel like he had conquered nature itself. The swirling winds outside never found their way inside. As the hours dragged on, David marveled at the success of his design. The cabin had endured its first real test, and it had passed with flying colors. The storm lasted through the night, but by morning it had passed. The snow had accumulated thick outside, but the cabin had weathered it without so much as a crack in its walls. David stepped outside to see the landscape, transformed, the world coated in a pristine blanket of white. His cabin stood proud against the snow, its spiral walls untouched by the storm's wrath. He smiled to himself, knowing that his creation had not only provided him warmth, but had kept him safe from nature's fury. By the time the snow began to soften in late March, David's cabin had gained a reputation far beyond his immediate circle. The trappers, settlers, and mountain men who had heard the tales of his spiral cabin started to come from miles around to see it for themselves. It was no longer just a curious design. It had become a symbol of survival, innovation, and the strength of those who lived in the wilderness. One afternoon, as David sat inside his cabin, tending to his fire and preparing for a trip into the mountains, he heard the familiar crunch of boots on snow outside. He rose to his feet, curious to see who had come this time. He wasn't expecting visitors, but the harsh environment of the Rockies had a way of bringing people together, especially those who understood the value of a good shelter. He opened the door to find a man standing in the snow, his face wind-burned and weathered from years spent in the wilderness. He was older than David, with a thick gray beard and a stoic expression that spoke of years of hardship. David instantly recognized him as one of the trappers from the next ridge, a man named Elias Dobbins, known for his fierce independence and harsh demeanor. "David Tanner," Elias called out, his voice gravelly. "I heard tell of your spiral cabin. Thought I'd come to take a look. If it's half as good as they say, you've done something special." David stepped aside and waved Elias into the cabin, a warmth in his chest at the rare compliment. Elias was a man of few words, and to hear praise from him meant something. As the older man entered, he immediately felt the difference in the air, the warmth that radiated from the spiral walls and the calm that settled inside the cabin. Elias paused, his eyes taking in the structure with an appraising glance. "You've built a good one here," Elias finally said, nodding as he walked around the room, inspecting the walls and the fire. "The wind doesn't touch you here, does it? I've seen men freeze to death in storms like the one we had back in January. They didn't have this kind of shelter." David smiled, feeling the weight of Elias's approval. It wasn't easy to earn the respect of men like him. "It works. Took me some time to figure it out, but I think it's the spiral shape. The wind just doesn't know how to get a hold of it." Elias was silent for a moment, standing by the fire, his eyes distant, as if he were deep in thought. "You know," he said slowly, "I've seen a lot of men come and go in these mountains. Some are good with their hands, others with a rifle. But few know how to build a place like this, something that will stand the test of time, not just the seasons." David nodded, a quiet pride filling him. "I didn't build it to last just one winter. I built it to last a lifetime." Elias turned to look at him, a rare smile flickering across his face. "Well, looks like you've succeeded. I don't know if I'll ever build one like this, but you've got something good here. Don't let anyone tell you different." With that, Elias gathered his things and prepared to leave, but not before offering one final word. You've done more than just survive, David. You've built something that'll outlast all of us." As Elias disappeared into the wilderness, David stood at the door, watching the man leave. The words lingered in his mind. "You've built something that'll outlast all of us." The storm had tested him, but this was the real victory, earning the respect of those who had spent their lives in the mountains. His spiral cabin, once just an idea born of necessity, had become a legacy. As the snow began to recede and the harsh winter months softened, David Tanner found himself at the center of a growing movement. What had begun as a solitary experiment in cabin design had blossomed into a beacon of innovation. Trappers, hunters, and settlers from across the region had begun making the trek to see his spiral cabin for themselves. David had always preferred solitude, but he couldn't ignore the rising tide of attention that his cabin had garnered. There was a hum of excitement in the air whenever someone mentioned the spiral cabin. Whispers of its warmth, strength, and resilience spread faster than the snow melted. One afternoon, as David sat by the fire, he heard a familiar crunch of boots in the snow. Looking up, he saw two young men approaching, the same trappers who had come to him months ago with skeptical eyes. This time, their faces were brighter, their steps lighter. They had returned, not out of curiosity, but for a different reason altogether. "David," one of them, a young man named Mason, called as he stepped inside, a wide grin on his face. "We've been thinking it over. You weren't just talking out of your hat with that spiral. That cabin of yours, it works, and we want to build one just like it." David's heart swelled with pride. He had never built the cabin for fame or fortune, but the fact that others now sought to replicate his design was a testament to the power of necessity-driven innovation. Mason and his companion, Carl, sat down by the fire, warming their hands as they shared their stories. They had been out in the wild, trapped in a brutal storm. Their cabin, a traditional log structure, had barely held up against the elements. Mason's voice held a quiet resolve when he spoke next. "We lost half our furs to the storm. We were lucky to make it out of there alive. But your cabin, it could have kept us warm, kept us alive." David listened, his thoughts turning inward. The idea that his design could help others survive was what had driven him from the beginning, but hearing it spoken aloud, especially from men who had faced the wilderness head-on, made the accomplishment all the more real. "Tell me what you've got," David said, rising from his chair and moving toward the table where his sketches and plans were spread out. He had already begun to refine his design, adding new ideas and improvements, each one born of another winter spent in the mountains. Mason and Carl eagerly gathered around as David began to explain the finer details of the spiral cabin, the way the logs interlocked, how the spiral shape funneled heat, and how every aspect of the construction was tailored to survive the brutal mountain winters. He explained the way the doorframe was reinforced, the roof's multi-layered construction, and even the small but critical details that made all the difference in the world during a blizzard. The two young men listened carefully, nodding as they absorbed the wisdom David had to offer. The world outside may have been full of danger and unpredictability, but in this room, around this fire, they felt like they were on the edge of something revolutionary. As the evening stretched into night, the warmth of the fire filled the cabin, and David's heart felt lighter. The work he had put into his home had become more than just a solution to his own problems. It was now a legacy, something that would extend beyond his own survival and touch the lives of others for years to come. As the years passed, David Tanner's spiral cabin became a cornerstone of mountain survival. Settlers and trappers built their own versions, improving upon the design where they saw fit, but always keeping the core principles intact. The cabin had evolved from a personal obsession to a symbol of resilience, and with each new cabin built, David's influence in the region grew. David, however, didn't seek fame or recognition. He had never been one to stand in the spotlight. His satisfaction came from knowing that others could thrive in the harsh conditions he had faced. As he grew older, the wilderness had begun to take its toll on him. The long winters were harder to endure, and his body ached with the weight of years spent hauling logs and enduring the cold. But there was one thing that kept him going: his cabin, his legacy. It had become his greatest achievement, the one thing he could leave behind. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-capped peaks, David sat outside his cabin, watching the light fade from the sky. His old bones had become accustomed to the quiet, the solitude that came with living far from others. The storm had passed, and the night promised a deep silence. Yet in that stillness, David could hear the echoes of the cabins that now dotted the ridges, all built in the image of his creation. David had long since given up any notion of expanding his homestead. He didn't need more land, more resources, or even more company. What he had was enough. He was content with his work, with the understanding that he had given something valuable to the world, a shelter that was more than just a refuge from the cold, but a testament to human ingenuity. That night, as the first stars appeared in the sky, David reflected on the years that had passed. He thought of the men who had sought his advice, the families who had found safety in cabins that mimicked his. His mind turned back to the early days, the days of loss, the days of struggle, and he realized how much those moments had shaped him. If it hadn't been for that storm, for the cold, and for the tragedy that had driven him to build his first cabin, he would never have found the inspiration to create something that would endure for generations. But now, with the fire crackling softly in the hearth behind him, and the mountains standing watchful around him, David knew that he had achieved something far beyond mere survival. He had built something that would last long after he was gone. The cabins, the design, the idea, it had all outlived him, and that was enough. As he stood ready to head inside, a sense of peace washed over him. The quiet victory wasn't in recognition nor in wealth, but in the understanding that his work had made a difference. And as the wind howled one last time through the ridges, David Tanner smiled, knowing that his legacy would stand firm against whatever came next. Years had passed since David Tanner first built his spiral cabin, and the once solitary wilderness that had been his home was now a landscape dotted with similar structures. The Rocky Mountains, once a place where few dared to venture, were now teeming with settlers, trappers, and homesteaders. Though many had followed in David's footsteps and built their own versions of his spiral design, each cabin remained a reflection of his legacy, a testament to the genius born out of necessity. But despite the changes, David's own cabin still stood tall, a beacon of survival, strength, and ingenuity. David had grown older. The storms were no longer just external threats, but a reminder of the passage of time. His hands had become stiff with age. His once muscular frame now bent slightly under the weight of years spent battling the mountains. But in his heart, he still carried the same fire that had driven him to create the spiral cabin all those years ago. He was proud of the mark he had left on the world, yet there was a lingering sense of quiet reflection. One cold morning, as the sun barely broke through the gray sky, David decided to visit a nearby settlement, a small community of families who had come to build lives in the rugged mountain terrain. He'd seen them grow over the years, their cabins built from his design, their lives slowly becoming intertwined with the landscape he had learned to love and respect. As he made his way down the snowy path toward the settlement, his thoughts were distant, but filled with a quiet satisfaction. The town had been bustling when David arrived, the sounds of children playing in the snow, and the clink of metal from the blacksmith's forge filling the air. He had visited the town before, but this time, as he walked past the cabins, it struck him how much had changed. The once sparse, isolated ridges were now home to dozens of people, all living their lives in the shadow of the mountains. David reached the central gathering place where a few of the younger trappers and settlers had gathered around a fire. They greeted him warmly, as they always did, recognizing him for the pioneer he was. He joined them by the fire, his old bones grateful for the warmth. As the conversation turned to stories of the past, one of the younger men spoke up. "You know, David," he said, his voice full of respect, "we all owe you a great debt. Your spiral cabin saved countless lives in the mountains. We wouldn't have made it through the winters without them." David chuckled softly, his eyes glistening as he looked around at the faces of the people gathered around him. "I never built it for recognition, just built it to survive," he said simply, his tone humble yet content. The young man continued, "But it's more than survival. It's legacy. You've changed the way we live out here." David leaned back, his hands clasped in his lap, staring into the fire. The crackling flames reflected in his eyes as he thought about how his design had helped build a community, a small but thriving group of people who had come to trust his methods and rely on his work. Though he'd never intended it, David had created more than just a shelter. He had helped forge a way of life in a land that had once seemed impossible to tame. As winter waned and the first signs of spring began to push through the snow, David Tanner found himself at a crossroads. His body, though resilient in its own way, had begun to slow. The long winters that had once felt like an adventure now left him exhausted, and his hands, though calloused and strong, had grown less reliable. The years of hard labor and long days in the mountains had caught up with him. David spent his final days in the cabin he had built, the same cabin that had witnessed the quiet victories, the long winters, and the trials of his life. Though his strength had waned, his mind remained sharp, and his pride in his work never faltered. The cabin, with its winding spiral walls and ingenious design, had weathered countless storms and years, standing as a silent testament to his legacy. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the ridgeline, David sat in his favorite chair by the fire. The warmth from the flames radiated through the cabin, and for a brief moment he felt at peace. The world outside was vast and silent, the mountains standing tall as they always had. But now he knew it was time to rest. The landscape had changed, and so had he. His legacy would continue in the cabins that dotted the mountains, in the lives that had been saved by his innovation, and in the memories of those who had learned from him. That evening, David fell asleep by the fire, the crackling warmth surrounding him like the embrace of an old friend. The winds had quieted, and the world outside was still. As he lay there, the memories of his life flashed through his mind, his struggles, his triumphs, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had made a difference. When morning came, David Tanner was no longer there. The fire had long since burned out, and the cabin stood silent. But as the sun broke over the peaks, its light touched the walls of the spiral cabin, casting long shadows over the land. The legacy of David Tanner, the man who had built a cabin that could withstand the worst the mountains had to offer, would never fade. Years later, travelers would still pass by his cabin, sometimes stopping to take shelter from the cold or to pay their respects. They would touch the walls, feel the warmth that still lingered in the air, and remember the man who had changed the way they lived in the wilderness. And so, David Tanner's story, his cabin, his legacy, lived on, forever etched into the mountains that had once tested him and in the hearts of all who had benefited from his vision and his will to survive.